There was another guy, a screenwriter, who I think took 6 trips back and forth over a few months, and then an additional 26 or 30 or so trips within Indonesia on different internal flights and things like that. And then he also wound up going to Hong Kong, and his sister went to Hong Kong. His whole family got dragged in. There was another woman who similarly took multiple trips, lost upwards of $100,000.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. Before I introduce my guest, Scott Johnson, whose voice you just heard, I have 2 announcements. The first is that the Unspeakeasy School of Thought, that's the official educational wing of the Unspeakeasy, a co-ed institution, is offering 3 writing courses this fall. They are a memoir workshop taught by legendary author Sherman Alexie, a fiction workshop taught by acclaimed novelist Chaley Wolfson-Widger, and a comedy writing course. And by that, we mean comedy writing, humor, satire, everything like that, taught by best-selling author Neil Pollack. Neil is also known as the greatest living American writer. That's his own designation, but it's true. This is kind of faculty we've got here, folks. Anyway, these are amazing authors and teachers. These courses will run on Zoom for 8 weeks. They start the week of September 16th, and you can find out how to apply by going to theunspeakeasy.com and pulling down the School of Thought menu and going to courses. We are working on a new website, but in the meantime, that's what you're going to do. This is really an awesome opportunity, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. Again, it's co-ed, not just for ladies, for everybody. Okay, second announcement is that guest speakers for our final Unspeakeasy retreat of the year in Woodstock, New York, have been announced. They are Carol Hooven, evolutionary biologist and author of the book Testosterone, the story of the hormone that dominates and divides us, and Tara Henley, celebrated Canadian journalist, author, and host of the Lean Out podcast. They will be with us for this retreat, which is October 21st through 24th in Woodstock. This is a women's only retreat. It is technically an overnight retreat, though you do have the option of staying off site if that works better for you. There are lots of options in Woodstock. Find out more at theunspeakeasy.com. Go to retreats, and this is really filling up quickly. Space is limited, of course, so don't delay. Okay, my guest is Scott Johnson. So here's the story here, at least part of it. Between 2013 and 2020, hundreds of people who worked in the entertainment industry, from actors and writers to photographers, makeup artists, and security personnel, were targeted by a brilliant and bizarre scammer who came to be known as the Con Queen of Hollywood. The Con Queen impersonated famous female studio executives and convinced many of her marks to spend huge sums of money, often on trips to Indonesia, but also on things like acting classes and personal training, all under the pretext of doing research or prep work for film projects that would be their big break. For years, journalists and investigators followed the case, and the story became the subject of podcasts and a short documentary. Journalist Scott Johnson covered the case for The Hollywood Reporter, eventually reporting that the Con Queen was actually a man named Hargobind Tahil Ramani, a genius impersonator who was also trying to make it as an Instagram food influencer. Are you following all this? Scott's book about the case, The Con Queen of Hollywood, The Hunt for an Evil Genius, was published last year, and a 3-part documentary series based on his book premiered on Apple TV this past May. Scott joined me for a conversation from France, where he now lives, and he talks about this truly incredible story, including the incredible experience of conducting so much of his reporting, including finally tracking down Hargobind, who's known as Harvey, in England in the early months of the COVID pandemic. Scott was living in Seattle at the time. He also talks about how reporting from wars and being the son of a CIA officer informed his reporting. Now, if you are not yet a paying subscriber, you're going to hear a lot of this interview. But if you want to hear the whole thing, you'll have to join our listener community at meghandaum.substack.com. With that, here's my interview with journalist Scott Johnson. Scott Johnson, welcome to The Unspeakable.
Thanks, Meghan. It's great to be here.
You've been a journalist for a long time. You've been a foreign correspondent. You've covered wars. You've been in Baghdad, Mexico, Africa. You've written about your own childhood in various parts of the world, which I hope we'll talk about in a bit. But eventually, you landed in the most perilous region of all, Hollywood, writing for the Hollywood Reporter. So
Yeah.
we're going to talk about a project that emerged out of a story that you wrote in 2018 that has led to your book, The Con Queen of Hollywood, which is now a docuseries. This is an incredible story. So maybe the best way to start is to just describe what that initial cover story for the Hollywood Reporter was about in 2018.
At the time I was working at the Hollywood Reporter, I was a staff writer, and I mostly did kind of long feature stories. And typically they would be about some weird, scammy or criminal or strange or unsettling story that had surfaced in Hollywood. And as you can imagine, there were lots of them. So I wrote about crimes and murders and weird lawsuits and things like that. I kind of often talked about the beat as the seedy underbelly of Hollywood. So one day, I think it was in the spring of that year, I got a tip from a colleague who said that she had heard about this scam, that somebody was being impersonated, like a high profile producer was being impersonated. And at first I didn't really think much of it, because you sort of hear that kind of stuff in Hollywood pretty often. There's
You do? Actually, you mentioned that in the book. It's like, really? It's very common for like powerful executives to have people impersonating them?
Well, not so much powerful executives, but just the general mood of the town kind of encourages scams and grifts, I guess, of one sort or another.
Right.
I guess that's more what I mean, that, you hear about a grift in Hollywood, and it's sort of like, okay, well, this one's probably not going to amount to much, or it's just sort of your run of the mill scam. And so that was what I thought going into it. And so I talked to this producer, or somebody in her office, I think, who told me that she couldn't really say much. There was some sort of impersonation going on, but that I should talk to this investigator on the East Coast who was kind of looking into it further. So I did, and from the investigator, I learned that there were a number of these high-profile producers who were being impersonated, but it wasn't clear, who was doing it. Was it an individual? Was it a group? Was it a criminal enterprise? What was the point? It was all very murky. And there were a number of other strange things which became clear later. But so I had this inkling that there was something afoot, but it wasn't totally clear what it was. I wound up talking to this guy who described this totally crazy situation. Basically, he'd been contacted by a very famous Hollywood producer named Amy Pascal, or person who we thought was Amy Pascal, and his Amy Pascal proceeded to describe to him a project that required him to travel to Indonesia to shoot a whole bunch of, just basically to do a whole bunch of photography for a big project that she was getting underway. This guy was a freelance photographer. He'd worked for all kinds of prestigious publications like The New Yorker and various other magazines. And he traveled all over the world. He was no dupe. He was skeptical and smart and savvy and well-traveled. And so he went along with this. He thought he was talking to Amy Pascal. She was very knowledgeable. She had all kinds of information about work that he had done before. She told him about this really interesting project in Indonesia. She was keeping a low profile because, of course, Amy Pascal, a few years prior, had been the subject of the Sony hack. And so her own reputation was, in tatters, and she was kind of trying to pick up the pieces. And so she was, as she told him, working to kind of build things from the ground up with people who weren't all that well known, but who were hungry and ambitious and had a good eye. And, he was such a person. So off he goes to Indonesia, and he proceeds to spend several weeks there, blows through tens and tens of thousands of dollars. And finally, after many weeks traveling all around the archipelago, he finally has the wool pulled off his eyes and realizes that he's in the middle of a scam, comes home, and is just utterly devastated. So I spoke to this guy for a couple hours, and apart from the financial toll that it took, which was considerable, I was really struck by one thing, which was just how messed up he was. He was really hurt by this, and he talked a lot about how he felt that he had been in a kind of a relationship with Amy Pascal, not a sexual relationship, although it did veer into some strange romantic areas at times, but it was really just sort of a very intense professional relationship. She was kind of mentoring him and bringing him along, and she was on the phone with him for hours and hours, and they discussed this project at length. And by the end of it, he was fully committed to the project and to her and to the contours of their relationship, such as it was. And so when it all fell apart, he just felt in a way like the fabric of his reality was falling apart. And so after I talked to him, I realized, okay, well, this is not a typical grift. This is really strange, and I don't understand what's going on. And that was kind of what started it, and it led to years and years of work, and it took some very strange turns and twists. And in the end, there were hundreds and hundreds of people who got swept into this thing, and many, many stories just like his, and some much worse.
Okay, so we should say that this con artist, whoever it is, was impersonating a female industry executive. So people like Amy Pascal, who you just mentioned, Kathleen Kennedy, Wendy Dang Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's wife, Deborah Snyder, and like all kinds of people were being targeted. Like not only people who wanted to sort of make it in Hollywood, but just like lots of different people. Can you maybe, before we reveal who this scam artist is and what all went into this, like who were some of the others, and what kinds of things were they tasked with?
Yeah, so this was another interesting twist in the story, is that the more I reported, the more kind of I started to think about them as victim classes started to emerge. So the first guy I talked to was a photographer, and there were many, many photographers, including one ultimately for National Geographic who'd worked all over the place. But there were makeup artists, there were screenwriters, there were actors, there were many, many veterans who had drifted away from the wars and into security contracting work.
Military veterans. Okay, people who
Military
have nothing to do
veterans.
with Hollywood. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, military veterans, and so these were people who would work as stunt doubles or bodyguards or security contractors to scout locations and things like
Okay, I
that.
see.
They got roped in by the dozens. There was a member of somebody from the Jamaican bobsledding community. There was an alpine climber. There were who else? I mean, there were just the writers, Instagram influencers. There were a lot of those. So there were just this kind of crazy assortment of different working professionals, almost all of them in the creative arts of one sort or another, sort of what Hollywood likes to call below the line people, stunt doubles, makeup artists, people who work behind the camera, behind scenes. And by and large, they were sort of mid-career, so they hadn't, for the most part, achieved any kind of wild success, but nor were they complete debutantes who had nothing to show for their work. They'd done stuff. A lot of it was quite impressive. They had, some of them, like some of the makeup artists, had worked with really big talent. So they were an assortment of people, and they all were given different tasks to do. So, for instance, a screenwriter would be asked to go for work on a project that was being developed in conjunction with the Chinese state-run cinema association, and spend time in Indonesia to develop a plot about about an action movie. And in order to do so, they had to travel around, look at scenes, absorb the culture, and sort of use the template of Indonesia as the kind of a canvas on which to paint their screenplay. These military veterans would be asked to go into scout locations. So they would go and they would, travel all around the country, assessing security risks and writing up these elaborate reports about what the potential risks were. Was there traffic? What was the best route in? What was the best route out? Were there any terrorist threats? Things like that. Photographers would be asked to go to shoot images for a variety of different projects. One of them had to do with the Chinese Olympics. Another one had to do with a children's book. But in all cases, they were told to, travel far and wide across Indonesia and document what they were seeing and compile the images into these elaborate sort of, storyboards, curate the pictures, send them off, get feedback, take some more pictures, take some more trips.
Are they like wiring money to someone throughout all of this? Or like, how is this scam artist actually getting paid?
Right. So this is one of the more puzzling and I think eye-opening aspects of the scam, because a lot of the money that the victims spent would just go to the airlines. So it didn't wind up
For their tickets.
in the scammers' pockets. Yeah, exactly, for tickets. Similarly, in some cases, the hotels would be paid directly, and in other cases, it would be prepaid a little bit, or there'd be a grift underway there. But for the most part, the money was A, not much, and B, took the form of extra services. So things like, so let's say a photographer would go and he would be told by an Amy Pascal, say, well, you've got to shell out, let's say $1,200 for photo permits. And we'll get you the permits, we'll get you the paperwork, but you need to pay this money because if you are caught taking pictures by the authorities, they're going to be very upset with you, and you might wind up in prison, and you don't want to wind up in prison in Indonesia, so better to get the permits. Or things like driving services, and the fees would get steadily higher and higher. Cars, translation services, administrative, visas, administrative details for paperwork. It just a whole assortment of kind of random seeming, almost bureaucratic or administrative costs, but that in the end, in some cases, climbed into the tens, and in a few cases over $100,000.
Wow.
And then, of course, across many, many years and many, many victims, the sum, the sum adds up. But yeah, the money question is interesting because, and this became something that kept drawing me back to the story. It wasn't. I mean, it became clear that money was not the principal, motivating factor. It was something else.
Right. So it really wasn't clear how much money this person was making, if much at all.
Yeah, exactly. Which sort of bolstered the idea in a way that it wasn't a scam, certainly for the victims, because they thought, well, I shelled out, all this money to the airlines. I paid for this, that, and the other thing. None of it could have gone to the scammer, or if it did, this would be, a scam involving multiple global corporations and airlines and so forth. And that was just too improbable. And so
Right.
it was very easy to conclude, well, it's not a scam. And it was hard for those of us trying to figure out what was going on at first, to see that it was a scam either, because it just seemed so strange and kind of like the work going into making this happen was in no way proportional to the financial reward.
This is something that people are sort of buzzing about in Hollywood for a long time, but it's always been assumed that this is a woman doing this because it's women who are being impersonated.
Right. It was assumed that it was a woman, and there was good reason to assume it was a woman. The few recordings that we got a hold of very clearly sounded like women. A lot of the victims described speaking to not just women, but I mean, like it was just very clear to them that they were speaking to a woman. And at a certain point, we asked, or I asked, was there any possibility that this was maybe more than one woman or not a woman? And the answer almost always came back, no, it's for sure a woman. And people swore up and down that it was a woman. So yeah, it came as a surprise for some of us at a certain point when it was revealed, and when we learned that it was not a criminal organization, not multiple people, but one person, and not a woman, but a man, and not an American or a native English speaker from, let's say, the UK or something, but an Indonesian man who's for whom English was not a native language.
There was a private investigator who you mentioned earlier, named Nicole Katsianis,
Yeah.
and she was actually working out of New Jersey. So how did she finally figure out who this was?
Nicole did a lot of really impressive investigative work, and by digging through a series of databases and talking to victims and getting recordings and cross-referencing all kinds of stuff, she ultimately discovered that the likely scammer was somebody who had come up on her radar before. Actually, it was a guy living in London, working as not working, but passing himself off as a food influencer on Instagram. And it turned out that he was an Indonesian guy. He was about 40 years old, and his name was Hargobind Tahil Ramani. And once she had the name, she was able to sort of start to pinpoint his location. But then the question became, well, who is he? Because he had this very public presence, but she didn't know anything about him. I mean, what was his, where did he come from? What was his past? Who was he really? Was he really a food Instagram influencer? Was that just another grift? Was it part of the impersonation scam? So all of those questions became paramount. But the fact that she now had, a definite suspect, that this was one guy, almost certainly living in the UK, kind of took the case to a new level, and it enabled her to go to the FBI and get it on their radar in a way that they hadn't wanted to entertain before.
How do you even begin to describe what is then found out about him?
So, yeah, I mean, I came across the identity in a slightly different way. Nicole had already found out who he was. And after I published the story, a few weeks later, I was contacted by somebody who said that he thought he knew who it was. In fact, he was sure he knew who it was. Nicole hadn't told me any of this. And so he agreed to get on a call with me. And we got on a WhatsApp call that lasted for quite a while. And he proceeded to tell me that the scammer was this guy, Hargobind Tahil Ramani, and that he knew him. And the guy that I was talking to was an Indonesian filmmaker, quite well known. And he started to spin out this completely unbelievable story to me, which is that this guy, Hargobind, not only was he the impersonator in question, who we had now at that point named The Con Queen of Hollywood. That was the title of the piece that appeared in the Hollywood Reporter. But that he had a criminal history in Indonesia going back years and years, and that he had perpetrated all manner of scams in Indonesia, targeting the creative communities there, filmmakers, makeup artists, other creative professionals. And not only that, but he then sent me a screenshot of some news coverage that had appeared in Indonesia about a man who was serving time in an Indonesian prison on terrorism related charges. So it was an old news article, but he pointed to a picture in one of the news articles and said, "That's the guy." So suddenly here I was, working on a story ostensibly about an impersonation scam in Hollywood, and I was suddenly confronted with the possibility that the scammer was a convicted terrorist in Indonesia. So this, as you can imagine, this was completely unexpected, and it was, and it just totally changed everything, because I thought, well, okay, that means that potentially, all these Hollywood impersonation scams are part of something much bigger or weirder or more sinister and maybe even dangerous. And, as a journalist, you can imagine it piqued my interest immensely. And it set me off on this road of discovery. So that, in a nutshell, is who he was. But yeah, the question continued to kind of haunt me, because I thought, what kind of person, you know, is a terrorist, but also longs to inhabit the mind and personality and career of an Amy Pascal or a Kathleen Kennedy, and who is simultaneously a food influencer on Instagram, living in the UK with 50,000 followers, who delivers inspirational messages and bromides to his audience every day. And, every time I kept working on the story, some other weird new twist would emerge, and I would discover, something else about this person. And so I just kept getting drawn back in to the story, because it kept taking on these new weird shapes every time I turned around.
Yeah. And so one of the people that this guy was interacting with, I guess under the guise of Amy Pascal, it got really sexual. And this guy goes by Harvey. I guess he's gay. He's targeting men primarily. It seems like there are some women involved, but he gets into these weird sort of psychological games with at least a couple of the men, and he's being very domineering and just manipulative and weird. So can you describe some of those interactions?
Yeah, so much in the way that there were multiple victim classes, like the photographers or the makeup artists, there were also different kind of levels that people could get drawn into the scam. So the one that was my entry point was the group of people who were convinced to travel to Indonesia on these fake work projects. But there were other people whose sole interaction with Harvey was through these very intimate and very disturbing kind of sexual or quasi-sexual, or in some cases almost weirdly romantic phone relationships that would go on for a long time, weeks and weeks in some
Yeah.
cases.
And they
And
were on Zoom, right? So they would be talking on Zoom, and the Amy Pascal person would have her camera off, and would the other person have their camera on in some cases? And she would be telling him what to do.
yeah, so it was in the pre-pandemic time, it was Skype in a lot of
Skype,
cases,
yes, of course,
or
yes.
or some other video interface. But yeah, there would be a video interface, not always, but often, and some of these victims would be asked to disrobe. There would be some of them were masturbating on camera. There was a lot of sexy talk. There was phone sex. And then in some cases, it was just like very kind of quiet and intimate and kind of creepy. So we got one recording, for instance, where you can hear the con queen sort of murmuring and asking the victim to give her kisses. That was a thing that I
Mm.
heard over and over again. The con queen would say, give me kiss, give me kiss. And then she would make a kissing sound. And then the victim, you can hear on the other end, is making a kissing sound and kind of murmuring. And they're just sort of whispering sweet nothings to each other, and just having this really intimate moment. And that was one kind of manifestation of it. I talked to these military veterans would tell me that they got into some very visceral, much more graphic encounters involving, in some cases, video, in some cases not. And then there were some people who were kind of crossovers where they would get into some kind of intimate phone relationship, some sort of sexual interaction, and then they would also travel to Indonesia. So sort of like a twofer.
Yeah, and let's be clear, like, how many times this guy made a round trip from LA to Indonesia in, like, the space of 3 weeks or something. I mean, like, this is crazy.
Yeah, well, there was one guy who I spoke to at length, and he also appears in the documentary. Really sweet guy, a photographer. He was about 26 at the time. Lovely guy, very good photographer, and he went to Indonesia, I think 4 times, back and forth, 4 round trips in the space. Well, let's see, 3.5 round trips. 3 full round trips, and then sort of a half
Mhm.
round trip because he'd gotten halfway home at one point, in the space of 3 or 4 weeks. And there was another guy, a screenwriter, who I think took 6 trips back and forth over a few months, and then an additional 26 or 30 or so trips within Indonesia on different internal flights and things like that. And then he also wound up going to Hong Kong, and his sister went to Hong Kong. His whole family got dragged in. There was another woman who similarly took multiple trips, lost upwards of $100,000. So, and then there were many more who I heard about, and I didn't include in the in the book. But yeah, there were a lot of people who lost a lot of money and took a lot of trips back and forth to Indonesia.
And what did they think they were gonna get? Like, with the photographer, obviously, he thought he was gonna get, like, a job on a big Hollywood movie of some sort. But, like, somebody like a security guard, what do they think they're gonna get out of this?
Well, the security guard one was interesting because a lot of those guys, I would see this, when I worked in the Middle East, you would meet these guys and they would be working as basically mercenaries or security contractors of one sort or another, and they would have incredibly dangerous jobs, doing runs from Baghdad out to Fallujah and back, and they would get shot and blown up all the time, and they were getting paid good money. But the ultimate sort of out for a lot of those guys was to land a job with a high paying celebrity or very wealthy client of some sort, providing a kind of a bespoke, very high level expert care for all things security related, whether it was
Okay.
route planning or bodyguarding or just general oversight of their, estate and person. And that was considered sort of the best possible outcome, is that you would leave the war and you would get a cushy gig working with a very wealthy person, and you would just ride that for all it was worth until you didn't need to, or until they got rid of you. And that happened sometimes, but it was very rare. But that was the dream, and that was certainly how a lot of these guys got swept in. So, for instance, there was a time when one of the impersonated women was a Christine Hurst Schwartzman, who was the wife of the billionaire hedge fund investor. And she peddled a story. When I say she, I mean the imposter peddled a story in her using her identity, that she was off on a lark, and that she and her husband were developing all kinds of amazing projects and funding them, and that they were going to be in the region for weeks and months, and they would need very high level, very good security from a small dedicated team of people for the duration. And that was the kind of project that would be immensely appealing to these guys. And they were a lot of these guys were damaged. They spent years in war zones. They wanted out. They were a very vulnerable population in many ways, even though they were hardened, killers and soldiers.
Yeah.
They were still vulnerable to the same kind of hopes and dreams and ambitions and desires that, like, a photographer, say, would harbor if he or she was contacted by a prominent executive and offered to a partnership on an exciting project that would land them in a Netflix boardroom where they could pitch their dream project and maybe get it greenlit.
Mm. Hmm.
So that was, the dangling of opportunity was sort of the constant theme, I guess. And it didn't matter whether people were military veterans or photographers or makeup artists. Opportunity is opportunity, and for all of them and each of them, it was different, and it was delivered in this incredibly compelling, persuasive way that they bought.
Right. What do we know about Harvey at this point? I mean, he grew up, he's from a fairly well-to-do family. He has 2 older sisters. His mother sort of doted on him, and then she died when he was maybe an older teenager. I can't quite remember. But he really was mentally ill. I mean, I don't know if you would call him a psychopath. How would you sort of diagnose his pathology?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily want to diagnose him because I'm not a mental health professional, but I can reflect what other people have described, and including the doctors, the mental health professionals who examined him in prison in the UK after he was arrested. And these were health professionals who were hired by his own defense team. And they concluded that his behavior showed, and I'm quoting here, psychopathic traits. They also mentioned other other potential diagnoses, but they all sort of were in that neighborhood of personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, pathological lying, um, and that was of a piece with the many, many accounts that I heard from people who did know him as a kid and as a teenager and later as a young adult when he studied in the United States, which was of somebody who, as one of them put it to me, was just creepy. And that creepiness, took different forms. For some people, it was clearly some form of mental illness, and for other people, it was that he was a bad person, a manipulative, deceitful, sadistic person who wanted to harm other people and who did harm other people in lots of kind of very disturbing and creepy and weird ways over a period of many, many years. And so, while I don't want to, put forth a specific diagnosis myself, I think that, and this is something I explore in the book, it's fair to entertain all these different theories and hypotheses as distinct possibilities
Yeah.
given his behavior.
And he had a remarkable gift with these impersonations. He had amazing things he could do with his voice. I mean, really like almost savant-like ability to impersonate people and to do several voices at once. So there were times where some of his victims were having conversations with what they thought were multiple people, and it's just really him doing all of the voices.
Yeah, he did exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, he would, yeah, like there were a couple cases where he would, a victim would be on the phone with, let's say two women and a man, or a man and a woman, but it was all just him. And that goes back to his childhood. People who knew him as a kid told me that even as a very young person, he was just fascinated with, impersonations. He would mimic voices, he would mimic characters in movies like Disney movies or on awards shows. He just had a kind of a passionate interest in that particular kind of self-expression, as even as a kid, a young kid.
Mhm.
And then it grew and evolved so that when he went to the United States as a student, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, he joined a series of debate programs at different colleges in California mostly, but also in the Midwest. And he excelled at that, at impersonating other people. They have in the world of debate, they have a variety of different kinds of programs. You can perform, you can perform other voices, you can perform other
Yeah.
characters. It's not just an argumentative style debate. So it's
No,
it's more of
it's
like a theatrical
dramatic
thing.
interpretation. I was actually, I'm embarrassed to say I was sort of involved in this world in high school. So
Oh,
yes,
you were.
the dramatic interp is a category.
Okay,
Yes.
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, how that all works, and he was in that world of dramatic, dramatic interp, and he was very good at it, very good at it. And so, what started in childhood as a kind of a fascination with characters and movies, it blossomed in high school. He was doing debate in high school and performances, and then it evolved further in college, and then it just took these completely twisted, weird forms later on. And pretty soon, and this is what always kind of amazes me, he was sitting in a room somewhere, picking up a phone, and convinced people to leave their homes and travel half a world away, and there to inhabit this completely made up fiction of his own devising, for weeks and months at a time. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary.
How did he choose his marks? Where did he find these people?
So a lot of times he'd call up people. Sometimes people would kind of cotton on that it was weird, or they just didn't feel comfortable, or they couldn't do it, or whatever. So he would cycle through like dozens and dozens of people, and then eventually he'd find somebody who was interested. And a lot of times he would go by recommendation. So, for instance, if he had one victim, or if he had somebody on the hook who was kind of interesting, but they didn't quite fit the bill for a trip to Indonesia, he might say, listen, I don't think it's going to work out with you, but could you kind of connect me to your network and hook me up with some other people who might be a better fit, or who might, be more willing to travel, or, who would be a better fit for this part? Like, I don't think you're the right match, but maybe you have some friends who are. So a lot of it would be through references. A lot of it he would just get by scouring the internet and looking at people's public profiles, their social media, their Instagram or Twitter, or their website, or
Mm.
their photo portfolio, and just sort of download huge amounts of information about them based on their public profile. And I think, most of us can relate to that. We put a lot about ourselves out there and make it easier for scammers to capitalize on that. So there was some of that. And then it was just, and then a lot of it was just kind of cold calling, like finding some random person and, trying it out. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't.
And again, how is he actually making money from this? Is he getting rich from this? Are they wiring money into some account that he then has access to? Or is he like doing this mostly or at least significantly for his own amusement?
So there was money to be made, not a lot. I don't think he got rich by it. I think he made enough to live a somewhat comfortable existence in the UK, living in a series of different kind of not luxury, but relatively nice apartment slash hotel dwellings where he could go out and get food from Marks and Spencer every day. He could buy himself really nice clothes, which he did on many occasions. Eat out at really good restaurants, some of the best in the British Isles, from London to Leeds to Manchester to Edinburgh. So, he had a nice life. He wasn't buying mansions or anything, but he certainly wasn't poverty stricken and living on the street. He was living well. And the way that the money worked, as we understand it currently, is that these victims would go to Indonesia, and when they were there, they would start to pay for some of these services that I referenced earlier. So, like driving services, permits, and things like that. And the money would be delivered to a driver who was almost always the same driver who collected the money from the victims and then presumably deposited it at the Con Queen's instructions into accounts that he could then access. And so the grift was basically done in concert with a kind of a local team of people. There were a couple of other people who were involved, but there's really no indication that those people had any inkling of the scope of what was going on. From their standpoint, they were just collecting money from a working traveler, much in the way that they might if you or I went to Indonesia and needed to hire a car or needed to get a service or whatever. It would be very easy for them to rationalize their involvement because chances are they didn't know what was really happening.
Okay. There's a pivotal scene in both the book and in the docu-series where you actually confront Harvey, for the first time and talk to him. In the docu-series, you have a hidden camera, or this is being filmed. We do have footage of this interaction. So can you just describe how you got to that point and what that was like after having done all this reporting on him, and presumably he knows about the reporting that's been going on about him, what it was like to actually see him in the flesh?
Yeah, so spoiler alert. But yeah, so it was 2020 and I had been working on the book for a few months by then. COVID had descended in February, March, and it was the summer of 2020, and I was still reporting a lot. I'd started writing a little bit, but not that much. I was still doing a lot of reporting, trying to figure out how I was going to do this book. And at that point, I got the people from this documentary got in touch with me and wanted to know if I'd be up for doing something. And it wasn't clear what. I don't think they really had an idea of what it would look like, and I didn't either. But we agreed to work together. And then the question became, well, what is this going to look like? How are we going to do this? And by that point, I had kind of exhausted everything that I thought I could do short of speaking to Harvey directly. And I realized that I had to. I couldn't really finish this book without talking to him or trying to talk to him. And I had been trying for a long time. I'd sent him messages. I'd tried calling numbers that I knew he had. I'd reached out via other people that I thought were in touch with him. So I tried, in a number of ways to get in touch with him, and he just hadn't answered anything. He'd never responded. And so now it was a tricky situation because COVID had totally shut everything down. There was no vaccine. People were dying, everywhere. Europe was particularly hard hit. I think Italy at that point was just a mess. In the States, the numbers were ticking up. Travel restrictions were dropping left and right. And Harvey he'd gone dark. He had taken down his Instagram account. And so there was a point where I really didn't know what to do. And then one day around that time, this woman in Indonesia who had known him as a kid and had her own career as a kind of like just sort of an influencer, sort of a lifestyle show. And she and a co-host would just chat about all manner of things. And, they would drink a drink and it was just sort of a very chatty, dishy, sort of Indonesia specific influencer show. But she didn't interview him at all about the scam because he hadn't been tied to the scam yet. So she just said she wanted to interview him just about his life. They'd been childhood friends. He'd left Indonesia. Now he was in the UK. What was his trajectory? And so she put up this interview, and he appeared in the interview with a kind of a selfie stick, shot himself, sitting at a desk, and behind him you could see this cityscape, and it looked very anonymous. It could have been any city. There were really no distinctive features of any sort. He was just kind of sitting there, and so they chatted for half an hour. And at one point in the interview, he said to her name was Hasina, he said, here I am. I'm living my best life. I'm very happy. I'm here in London in my flat, and everything's great. So she puts this video up on Instagram, and I see him, and he's sitting there in this place that looks like his home. I mean, it looks like a place where he lives. And you can see in the background this city, and he says, I'm in London. So I immediately thought, okay, well, I think now if I'm going to try to find him, now is the time to do it. So I took a bunch of screenshots, and I set about trying to figure out where he was. And long story short, I figured out, so he wasn't in London as he claimed. He was actually in Manchester. And then with the help of a friend, I figured out that more or less where I thought he was in this big city. There were a few landmarks, and this friend of mine had actually lived in Manchester he was from Manchester. So he had actually worked in this building that he recognized in the picture. And so we figured out more or less where we thought he was. And it turned out that there was a building in that area that advertised itself as an apart hotel, which is something you see in Europe all over the place. They're these kind of half apartment, half hotel dwellings that are
extended stay.
They're sort of perfect for, like extended stay, exactly. And they're perfect for people who are kind of on the move, or business travelers, people who don't want to stay in one place for too long. And so I thought, okay, well, it's COVID. He's probably not moving that much. He's clearly, in this place now-ish. I mean, he's been there very recently. He's not posting on his Instagram account, which means that he's probably not traveling around the country, visiting different restaurants. Chances are he's here. And so I decided to go to Manchester, and that was not an easy choice. I got on the phone with a lot of people in the UK who advised me, under no circumstances should I get on a plane and travel to the UK now.
Why? Because of COVID or
COVID,
because
yeah.
of
People said it could shut down at any moment.
And you were living in Seattle at the time.
I was living in Seattle, and they explained that there were these very strict procedures in place. You had to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival. The government tracked you. You had to sign up on this app. Anytime you entered into any building, you had to register on this app, and if you didn't, you could be subject to a 10,000 pound fine. And there were just a whole host of kind of measures in place to make a trip very difficult. And it was COVID, and a lot of people were getting sick, and a lot of people were dying, and so yeah, it was tricky, and I debated about it for a while, my family and friends and so forth, and then I just decided I have to go. I have to try to find this person. I can't actually do this book if I don't. And so I did. And so I get to Manchester, and I booked a place at that very apart hotel. And I set about trying to find him. And after a few days...
That was a taste, a long taste, of my interview with Scott Johnson about his book, The Con Queen of Hollywood. It's also a 3-part documentary series on Apple TV, starring Scott Johnson. If you want to hear the rest, and I know you want to hear the rest, why wouldn't you become a paying subscriber at meghandaum.substack.com. In the meantime, I can tell you that Scott is the author of 2 highly acclaimed books. In addition to The Con Queen of Hollywood, he's the author of The Wolf and the Watchman, which was longlisted for a National Book Award, Penn USA Award. It was a Washington Post notable book, so please check that out. Scott now lives in France with his wife and his 2 children. I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.